do have a request to move item 8 up on the agenda, which is the economic analysis of the water acquisition efforts. I need a motion to move that.
I'll make that motion.
Have a second?
Yep, second.
Have a second? I asked. Yeah, I felt it'd be better having that presentation up front rather than get through the agenda. Yeah. More for public information before we lose our crowd. Okay, I have a motion and a second. May I have a vote, please? Crazy.
Motion passes unanimously.
All right, thank you, council. At this time, I'm going to ask Mark Puckett to help introduce the program or the presentation, please. Good evening, Mark.
Good evening, Madam Mayor, members.
All right.
That's twice tonight.
All right.
Let me.
I think you guys are trying to tell me something.
Mr. Mayor,
right.
members of council.
It's all right.
My apologies. Given the misinformation that has been provided recently regarding the town's financing plan, the town manager felt it was important to have an independent review of the numbers in the town's financing plan, which have been presented to council several times and the public previously. So the town manager, Frank Robinson, had asked to engage in a contract with Beacon Economics to provide, or excuse me, with Dr. Christopher Thornberg to provide that review, and then asked me to provide all of the information that we had based our analysis on to Dr. Thornberg, and that included also for their consideration the Urban Futures Report, all of the studies that I have performed, as well as the economic analysis that has been performed by Liberty Utilities, which they had paid Dr. Houston to provide. That information included the 2015 CPUC annual report for Liberty Utilities Apple Valley, and it did not include the 2016 annual report because that report has not yet been filed. It's due March 31st, and as of today, it is 2 months late, and we still have not seen that report for 2016. And there was one comment made earlier, and I would like to respond to that now before introducing Dr. Thornberg, and that was a comment relating to audited financial statements. Liberty Utility Apple Valley has never once prepared an audited financial statement, never once. It's a wholly owned subsidiary of the Park Water Company prior to its purchase by the Carlyle Group, and then subsequently purchased by Algonquin Power and Utilities of Toronto, Ontario, Canada, which has assigned management of the Liberty Utilities Apple Valley to their American subsidiary, Liberty Utilities. While Liberty Utilities, their American subsidiary, as a whole may prepare audited financial statements, there is no audited financial statement for Liberty Utilities Apple Valley. And if there is one, I would challenge anyone from Liberty Utilities to provide that information to me. I'd like to see it. Having said that, I'd like to introduce Dr. Christopher Thornberg. Dr. Thornberg is the director of the UC, University of California, Riverside School of Business Center for Economic Forecasting and Development, and an adjunct professor at that school. He is also the founding partner of Beacon Economics and widely considered to be one of the nation's leading economists. An expert in economic forecasting, regional economics, labor markets, economic policy, and industry and real estate analysis, he was one of the earliest and most adamant predictors of the subprime mortgage market collapse and of the global economic recession that followed. In 2015, Dr. Thornberg was named to the California State Treasurer John Chang's Council of Economic Advisors. He also serves on the advisory boards of Paulson and Company, Inc., one of Wall Street's leading hedge funds, and of the Los Angeles Area Chamber of Commerce, Southern California's largest not-for-profit business federation. Between 2008 and 2012, he served as the Chief Economic Advisor to the California State the State Controller's Office, and was chair of then State Controller John Chang's Council of Economic Advisors. Widely quoted in the media, he has appeared on NBC's The Today Show, ABC's Nightline, CNN, Fox News Channel, NPR, and is regularly quoted in major national and California dailies, including the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Washington Post, Los Angeles Times, and Chicago Tribune. A highly sought-after speaker, Dr. Thornberg regularly presents to leading business, government, and nonprofit organizations across the globe. These groups include Chevron, the New Yorker, City National Bank, Rio Mac, the California State Association of Counties, Colliers International, State Farm Insurance, the City of Los Angeles, and the California and Nevada Credit Union League, among many others. He has testified before the U.S. Congress House Committee on Financial Services on municipal debt issues, and before the California State Assembly Committee on Revenue and Taxation regarding changes related to Proposition 13. He has also been the featured High Desert Summit speaker for many, many years. Dr. Thornberg has been involved in a number of special studies measuring the effect of important events on the economy. These include the NAFTA treaty, the California electricity crisis, port security, California's water transfer programs, and the terrorist attack of September 11, 2001. Dr. Thornberg holds a PhD in business economics from the Anderson School at UCLA and a Bachelor of Science degree in business administration from the State University of New York at Buffalo. Mayor and Council, please join me in welcoming Dr. Christopher Thornberg.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, council members, for having me here. Mark wanted to read that whole bio. I apologize for that. But,
Mark likes to make presentations himself. So.
It's a pleasure to be with you talking about this, of course, I think important decision for the city. And just a bit of a background, I mean, we know why we're here. Obviously, there is the issue with whether or not to purchase through eminent domain this local water utility. And the debate, as we've heard through some of the public comments, is whether or not this is a good financial move for the town. Mark came to me and his staff came to me because they had produced some reports, and these reports have been rebutted in part by Dr. Husing in a report he wrote not too long ago, and on top of that, in terms of a letter that was written by Liberty Utilities to the town itself. And Mark wanted me basically to go through these various pieces of evidence and give my honest opinion as to where things sort of stacked up, as the case may be, which is what I did. Now, I said to him up front, I can't, we don't promise answers. It's not what we do, but I'm happy to look through this material and take a look and see what the relevant facts are, and at least come up with a conclusion as to where I think, shall we say, the weight of truth lies, whether it's in the town analysis or in some of these critiques. Sometimes the truth is in the middle. That is not one of these times, to say the very least. In fact, looking through the various reports, a couple things immediately stood out to me. No financial analysis is perfect. We all understand there's risk in the future, and when you don't have all the facts, you can't necessarily put together, shall we say, a perfect set of scenarios. On the other hand, the study I saw the town produce is based on real data where data is available, and where data is not available, they made assumptions based on quite conservative estimates, as far as I was concerned. Nothing they did struck me as being, shall we say, an effort to tip the scales, to put a thumb on the scales, as the case may be. And candidly, at the end, they end up with a lot of room for error. That is to say that even if some of their numbers don't come in quite as rosy as they would hope, the town still stands to benefit. Now, this actually makes economic sense. You have to remember that moving this utility from private to public ownership confers two massive cost advantages on ratepayers. The first is you go from being a tax-paying private sector enterprise to a public sector, nonprofit, untaxed enterprise. That all by itself creates huge cost advantages for the town and for the ratepayers. Now, that's an enormous cost saving over private ownership. And of course, the other part of it is cost of capital. The town has a better credit rating than Liberty Utilities. Whether it's debt that may be conferred or just the basic cost of equity involved in a private sector operation, you transfer that to the public sector, the ownership of the town, and you're going to see those capital costs go down. Between those two things, you would expect that public ownership would be a better bet for ratepayers in the community. It just makes sense. And in fact, I think that that's borne out by the fact that the vast majority of utilities in the United States are in fact publicly owned. That's why I started saying public utilities, because we hardly ever hear private utilities. That's actually the unusual feature of our economic landscape. Not the public utility. That's over 88% of Americans are serviced by publicly owned water agencies. That's how the system works. Now, in terms of the critiques, Dr. Husing's analysis, I'm not sure what to say about this. I didn't understand. I did understand where he got his numbers from, but I didn't understand his rationales for these numbers. In fact, these numbers to me didn't seem right. To me, he used interest rates that just really weren't in the realm of credibility in terms of the potential for rates to be where they are in a couple of years when this purchase actually goes through. And of course, he also uses valuations for the company that on one hand either are based on faulty mathematics or on the other hand seem to be pulled randomly out of some old report that doesn't have any basis in anything I can see of whatsoever. He doesn't seem to pay any attention to actual numbers that are out there for us to look at. And of course, he fails to recognize, I think, some basic realities of the utility landscape, mainly what I just said, that the vast majority of utilities are in fact publicly owned for the advantages I already mentioned. And of course, as for Liberty Utilities' critique, their big thing is, of course, that the costs are much higher, and they basically perform their own, shall we say, incredibly unaccounting maneuver of claiming that capital investments are in fact an ongoing expense, which they are not. And in fact, to pretend those are expenses shows an appalling lack of not only basic accounting standards, but even the basic idea of economics and how companies are valued. So, but the thing I found, I think, most intriguing of all was when you put it all together, when I seem to be saying the critiques, if you add it all together, it kind of boils down to this. This is an incredibly high-valued enterprise that makes no money. And oh, by the way, you're going to be paying incredibly higher asset prices, interest rates on this incredibly high asset price. Well, you can't have your cake and eat it too. You can't have it all three ways. You know, these three critiques don't make any sense. If the enterprise truly doesn't make any money, Liberty Utilities should be more than thrilled to be rid of this asset. That doesn't make any sense. If interest rates spiked the way that Dr. Husing presents, then you'd expect a big decline in asset prices, because the kind of interest rate hike he's talking about would be a calamity for our economy given where rates are right now. You can't have it all three ways. You got to pick your tack. And they didn't. Instead, they took three different approaches that are mutually incompatible. They just don't make sense. So in this case, the truth wasn't in the middle. In this case, I have to come down squarely on the side of the town's analysis. The numbers there make sense. Now, how do I arrive at that? Well, I like to point out that this thing can boil down very simply to three major conversations. If you want to understand whether or not this is a good move for the town and for the ratepayers of the utility, you have to know three things. What's going to be the purchase price at some point in time in the future? Eminent domain goes through. What will the town be asked to pay for the utility? Second thing, of course, is the town's going to have to borrow money through bonding to pay for that. What will be the interest rate on that? Now, you put that together, the interest rates and the payment, and you end up, of course, with that annual bond payment. Now, the big question for ratepayers, the big question for the town, is will the operational profits of the utility more than pay for those annual bond payments? If the number's greater, that is to say, you're going to be making more operational profits than the cost of that debt servicing, you win. You're going to have extra money coming into the town. You'll be able to provide cuts to ratepayers, price cuts to ratepayers. If it doesn't hold true, as Dr. Husing surmises, then either the town's going to holding the bag and they're going to be losing money, have to raise taxes or revenue somewhere else, and equivalently ratepayers may end up paying more for the water, not less. So it's the three things. You have interest rates, you got the amount of the purchase, and the operational profits of the enterprises, and I'm going to kind of go through those real quick. How about the purchase price? Let's start there. Well, what's interesting is the best way to consider purchase prices is the way that most, say, real estate appraisers do. We don't sit down and necessarily, there's lots of different ways of valuing real estate, but in California, the courts always tend to err on the side of similar purchases. What is the market currently paying for this asset? Well, while we don't obviously have a direct value for this, we do have some very important points. For example, the rate base is about $58.4 million on this particular utility. That's probably not a perfect place to start, but it's a place to start. That's what they make a rate of return on, that $58.4 million. Of course, we have another number. That comes from the sale, from the purchase of the group from Carlisle back in 2015. That purchase was net cash about $255 million. Now, there were 3 utilities in that purchase, and of the 3, Apple Valley's, the water agency, was the smallest of the 3. Slightly less than a third of all the ratepayers compared to those 3 utilities. Now, I don't have a big breakdown, but that says to me, at most, the value of this utility would be about a third of that, probably a little bit less would be my guess. That, of course, puts us somewhere in the $85 million range. And then, of course, we also have the recent sale of another part of the utility of that package in Missoula, Montana. That utility was purchased actually through eminent domain for about $88.7 million. So you add it all up and you start to see that we have a basic range, somewhere in this kind of $60 to $80 million range as of right now. Maybe towards the high end, maybe towards the low end. Hard to parse it, but at least it gives us a starting point. Now, the big question, of course, is that might be what it's worth today. What's it going to be worth in a couple of years? Where are asset markets now? Are we going to see an enormous surge in asset prices? Well, I think we all know the stock market's near an all-time high level. In fact, it's been jittery lately, to say the very least. If you talk to folks in the commercial real estate industry, there's nervousness about asset prices there. In fact, if you look at the senior loan officer survey, it shows that banks are pulling back on purchases of commercial real estate because they feel the market's getting a little frothy and these assets are overpriced. On top of all this, the Fed is starting to raise rates a bit, which is putting a little bit of a crimp on lending markets, and that's going to pull the asset markets back as well. And of course, we're still mired in this low growth place. Add on top of everything else this enormous uncertainty coming out of Washington, D.C. with the current administration, and you end up with a situation where, and listen, financial market forecasts are always a little bit dodgy, but it's hard for me to suggest that this thing's going to go up by 20, 30% over the course of the next couple of years. I would say on the outside, maybe a 10% increase, maybe 12% would be a top range, possibly less than that. You add it all up, my realistic range would be probably in the $75 to $90 million range. That's what I would come up with. Now, again, that's a bit of a back of the envelope, and if I wanted to get closer in, there'd be a lot more analysis involved. But for me, I was comfortable, particularly given that the city was thinking that they were going to pay $80 to $100 million. I see numbers that not only seem to line up with my expectations, in fact, they seem relatively conservative relative to how I would think about this particular situation. Now let's contrast that to Dr. Husing and his estimates. These numbers range in a completely different place, from about $150 million to $200 million. Now, the $200 million number, it comes out of apparently some 2-year-old blue ribbon committee report. And he states that someone on this blue ribbon committee worried that they would have to pay $200 million. I don't know what to make of that. That's a random number from an old report that means absolutely nothing. There's no fact, there's no basis, there's no number there. It's just pulled out of thin air. You might as well just pull the number out of a hat and attach a million to it. And of course, his low end of 150, he actually based, interestingly enough, on the same Carlisle sale that I referred to, except for Dr. Husing doesn't seem to understand basic financial conversations. The Carlisle sale very clearly said that the overall consideration, that is to say the rough amount of money they received, was $327 million, which included $77 million of debt that were being moved over to the purchaser. So in other words, the actual cash paid for the enterprise was about $250 million. Then, of course, there were some transaction costs coming up with this $255 million number. But, of course, that's not how Dr. Husing calculated it. He took the $327 million, added the $77 million to come up with this $400 million plus number. Well, that's not a real figure. That's not what was paid for those 3 utilities, and you can't use that number to create the $150 million range. These numbers don't make any sense. As simple as that. They're far outside of what the city should actually have to pay, and as such, that part of his analysis falls apart completely. There's just no there. Interest rates are another place. The town used 3 estimates, about 2% as the low end, if the town should be able to access this incredibly cheap source of money from the state. I'm not sure if that's a possibility or not. Candidly, it's not important, and I think that's the most important thing. Current market rate for municipal debt's about 4%, and then as a high range, they looked at about 75 bips up, or a rate in a couple of years of about 4.75%. So in other words, if you will, putting aside the potential access to this state funding, what the town is estimating is that overall rates are going to shift between now and 2 years from now by about 0% to 0.75%. Now again, let's contrast that to what Dr. Husing says. First of all, he completely ignores the potential for state funding. That didn't even enter into his calculations. And then he suggests that a realistic rate would be 5.25 to 7.25%. In other words, he's expecting long-term rates to rise by 1.25% to 3.25% over the next 2 years. Now, that may not seem a lot, particularly if you're, a little bit older like I am, and you remember the years back in the day when, my father, of course, always has to tell me about his mortgage he paid for back in 1980, where he had a 17% interest rate, and so on and so forth. But putting all that to one side, these sort of numbers relative to recent history, which is actually what I would call the relevant history, these numbers are really high. These are really high. And his justification for these really high numbers boils down to 2 things: Fed tightening and full labor markets. So, first of all, if we wanted to come up with a realistic range, as opposed to looking forward, let's look past. As I said, the far, far past doesn't help us a lot, but let's look over the past 5 years. On the right-hand side here, I did a little bit of a breakdown, and I'm using the 30-year Treasury here to kind of give you a sense of things. The 30-year Treasury is roughly about 2.94% right now. The estimated municipal bond rate right now is about 4%. So the muni bond rate's about 100 bips higher than the 30-year bond rate, as the case may be. Now, over the last 5 years, what I did here is I simply took those averages, the high and the low over the last 5 years, and I applied that same spread to the municipal bond rate. And relative to the last 5 years, what I come up with is the potential range of interest rates somewhere between 3.29 and 4.95%. That's just, again, applying the last 5 years to what might happen to 2 years. That says to me that the potential range of interest rate outcomes that you'll be facing in 2 years should range reasonably from a decline of 0.7%, about 70 bips, to an increase of about 100 bips. Now, that's a broad range, and I understand that, and it's, again, very quick, but it's a nice way of looking at things, because we always say The recent past is usually a best gauge of the future. That 0.7 to 1% range would be something I'm comfortable with. Well, compare that to what the town suggested. The town suggested 0% to 0.75. Perhaps a little low in the top end, 0.75%, but they didn't even take into account the fact that interest rates could be lower. And by the way, they really could be lower in a couple of years. This idea that they are absolutely going to have to go up, that's just not true. It's just not true at all. The big rise we saw was because there was in the recent months was due to the expectation that Trump was going to come in and basically cut taxes and spend a lot more, thus creating an enormous surge of government borrowing. Well, that reality does not appear to be taking place at this particular point in time, and the bond markets are getting a little bit of uncertain, and they're already starting to take a little bit of a step back. As for these other two ideas, let's again consider a little bit of history. Take, for example, the left-hand side here. This is 2-year changes in 10-year bond rates, and I apologize for using 10 and 30. The reason is that 30 and 20-year bond rates aren't continuous because there are points in time where the Treasury stopped issuing them. And so the 10-year rate gives us the longest range. The good news is that the spreads between 10, 20, and 30 are really consistent over time. So you can look at the 10 and it basically gives you this almost the same picture as what the 20 would be if we had continuous data. And just take a look at this. I go back all the way to 1992 here. And the biggest increase in 10-year bond rates we've seen over a 2-year period since 1992, for 25 years, the biggest increase over 2 years is 100 bips. That's the most the 10-year bond market has moved in 2 years since 1992. Now, Dr. Husing says at a low end, it's going to increase by 1.25%. And in a high end, it's going to increase by 3.25%. Wow. I don't know how anyone could possibly make that forecast, given how that flies in the face of history. And I can tell you firsthand, if the bond market moved that much in that short of a period of time, you shouldn't be worried about your utility. You should be worried about all hell breaking loose in the U.S. economy, because that would be calamitous to the nth degree. And of course, on top of everything else, if we saw that sharp of an increase in interest rates, asset prices across the board would be plummeting as a result of that. So this just doesn't mean, these numbers are just completely outside the realm of realism. There's just no there. It's just not realistic. And of course, another one of his justifications, well, we have full employment. Okay, well, let's look at the last 3 periods of time we had full employment, from 88 to 90, from 98 to 2001, from 2006 to 2008. All these periods of time, unemployment had hit bottom and basically gone sideways over that period of time. In all 3 periods of time, long-term interest rates went down, not up. The idea that a full labor market causes interest rates to go up, I don't know where that came from. It's not in any economics book I ever read. It's just made up. It's not real. Doesn't happen that way. Even the idea of Fed tightening. Remember, the Fed controls the federal funds rate. It's a short-term overnight borrowing rate between banks. And the Fed tightens that largely to pull back on bank lending, which in turn slows down the financial markets a bit, slows down transactional. But the actual impact on long-run rates is very small. And it's what's interesting, because people always assume the federal funds rate is about long-term rates. It's not. In fact, by my analysis, the pass-through of the federal funds rate to the 10-year bond is about 1 to 8. That is to say, if they increased the federal funds rate by a full percentage point, you would expect to see the 10-year bond rate go up by 10 to 20 bips, somewhere in that range. Not very much. Long-run rates really don't respond much to Fed tightening. It's short-run rates and bank lending. That's what responds, not long-run rates. And the idea, again, that the Fed's going to create this scenario, it just doesn't make any sense. There's no there. There's no economics behind that particular statement. And as such, any bond servicing based on $150 million at a 7% interest rate, that's just not a credible scenario. That scenario doesn't exist in the real world, and thus is really not, or should not be, any part of this conversation. Then, of course, there's the net revenues. Now, the net revenue analysis all boils down to not so much, if you will, what the bonds will cost on an annual basis, but rather what this enterprise will spin off. Now, again, what were the estimates from the city, or town, excuse me? Well, the town really did three things. They used the profits, the net income, right off the financial statement of Liberty Utilities for this particular utility, about $4.3 million they made in 2015. They used that as a baseline. Now, mind you, it's an interesting number because since then there's been increases in rates. As noted, we haven't seen the 2016 number. We don't know if that's higher or lower, as the case may be. My guess is it's probably higher, otherwise it would have been released by now. But starting with $4.3 million, that's straight. That makes sense. And then, of course, you have the net tax saving, which, again, is right there in the sheet. You could see how much money they paid in taxes. Pull that out. That's $3.6 million. So altogether, you have about $7.8 million. Now, on the left-hand side here, I'm showing you some estimated debt costs. It is $70 million and $100 million. And then I have with the state funding of 2%, 4%, and 4.75%. Now, there's a whole other set of efficiencies that Mark and his crew talked about, which is this $4 million. Now, there's debate over the $4 million. Mark and his crew say we might get $4 million in efficiency. We'll reduce costs in terms of overhead and costs in terms of these sort of side agreements. We're not sure where they're shoveling the money. And they say, you don't know what you're talking about. This $4 million is baked in. You're still going to have to pay for it. I'm inclined at this point in time to think Mark probably has his finger on something. But you know what? It doesn't matter. The $4.3 million plus the $3.6 million, that pays it right there. And if you get $1 million of that $4 million, that's gravy. You get $2 million, you're happy. $3 million, wow. The point here, that debate, it's irrelevant because this makes sense even without that $4 million, even without it. Simple as that. And of course, again, if you end up with if you end up with 4% for $90 million, even better. You're going to be able to cover your costs even if it's a 5% at $100 million, which I think probably not realistic. Now, one of the big complaints, and this is again one of these things that I can't fully fathom, Liberty Utility wrote a letter to the town and they said, well, you don't seem to understand profits because you're not counting the $6 million in capital expenditures we made. To which I say, I'm not sure if Liberty Utility understands what profits are because capital expenditures have nothing to do with your profitability. Capital expenditures are investments you make in the company. And by the way, those investments add to the value of the company. But of course, over time, the value of those investments diminish through what we call depreciation. So one of the big questions that Liberty Utility asked the town was, how are you going to pay for that $6 million? Well, I can tell you one way. Right off the bat, Liberty Utility writes off right now a little over $3 million a year in depreciation. That's not an actual expense. Liberty Utility didn't pay anybody $3 million. That's $3 million in free cash that we haven't even discussed. And of course, if there are capital investments to be made, there's $3 million of it, all by itself. So this argument, again, doesn't make any sense. And even if it did, let's imagine for a second that they really did pay $6 million a year. So you're telling me the Liberty Utility lost money the last 5 years? They're making $4 million but spending $6 million in capital costs and they lost money? Well, if that was truly the case, would they really want to hang on to this utility? Wouldn't they be thrilled to sell it to you? Actually, if they were losing money annually, I think they'd be thrilled to give it to you. The fact that they're fighting so hard against this process suggests that perhaps there's a little more profitability here than they seem to be indicating. Now, the other, of course, response I have to this is, I couldn't find any evidence of $6 million in capital expenditures. Now, it was noted by one of the commenters, and they're absolutely right, I am not a CPA, but unlike what the commenter said, I do have some familiarity with accounting statements. I'm an economist, and economists have to constantly use financial statements for various sorts of economic uses, and that means we need to be able to read what a balance sheet is and what an income statement is and understand roughly how different things pan out. Well, on the right-hand side, I have some entries from the 2015 unaudited Apple Valley balance sheets. And I was intrigued to see that they claimed about $4.3 million in profits, and indeed, they rolled $4.3 million profits into the retained earnings. So it does seem like they made that money. Now, they also claim that they made over $6 million of investments that year. In fact, or actually, I'm sorry, about $8 million, close to $8 million. But again, let's go back to that. They made, in that year, they had about, what they claimed was about $7.8 million in capital investments. They had capital depreciation of about $3.2 million. So adding up, they claimed to make about $4.7 million in capital investments on net. Now, if your balance sheet's going to balance and you made $4.7 million, where did the money come from? Well, one place would be retained earnings. Well, that didn't go down, it went up. It went up by the amount of profits. Okay, did they borrow money? I didn't see any bank debt at all on their balance sheet. They didn't mention anything about it. Was there a new capital and equity infusion? No, there was no capital and equity infusion. In fact, I went all the way through the balance sheet because I know balance sheets have to balance. And the only thing I could find that would kind of match that amount was a note payable to some other utility, to the other utility in the Liberty Utility portfolio. Huh? Well, if they did pay that money for capital investments, why is it showing up in a note payable to their other utility? I echo what Mark said. This is not a real financial statement. The only thing real is the amount of money they put in their checking account, which was $4.3 million. The rest of the numbers didn't make any sense to me whatsoever. And to me, I was, shall we say, a little confused by exactly what it is they were trying to show in those balance sheets. It did not in any way, shape, or form suggest they made the capital investments they actually made. And of course, last but not least, there's this idea that the town's just not capable of handling it. You're too small, and you just don't have a right, and you should just go away. Well, first of all, you're not going to be running a utility. You're going to be overseeing a utility. The utility, of course, is going to be run by the staff and the management, who I presume will be kept on board, just like they kept on board through the last couple sales they went through. They're local. They're people who work there. They have careers there. I would gather that the people who know how to run the utility will continue to run the utility. They will just have, shall we say, different folks running the show, as the case may be. In this case, the city, the town. Of course, there's also this idea that maybe that's true, but the private sector is just inherently better than the public sector. And by the way, I did my PhD at UCLA, which is known as Chicago West. I learned all about the wonders of the market. I believe deeply in the wonders of the market when a market can exist. You see, the problem with the idea that competition is good for Apple Valley boils down to the idea that there is competition in your water markets. In other words, if one of your folks here doesn't like their water service, they can just turn on a different spigot in the house and have water from a different water company. Now, we know, of course, that such a degree of competition does not exist. That's why we call this a regulated monopoly. The economies of scale in certain industries, including water and power, are such that having one provider is the only low-cost solution. You can't have multiple layers of pipes running through a town. It doesn't make any sense from an economic perspective. And as a result of that, the basic idea that private sector competition applies to utilities, well, that doesn't work. So I'm all for the private sector when there can be an active market for competition. That's not this market. That criticism does not apply. So let's say ratepayers are upset. What do you do? Well, right now, they have to complain to some CEO in Toronto, Canada. If it shifts locally, they can come here and complain. That to me is a step up. And of course, last but not least, the proof is always in the pudding. If the public sector is so absolutely incapable of running a utility, particularly a water utility, why is it that Apple Valley ratepayers pay 57% more than Hesperia and 33% more than Victorville, your two local publicly owned water utilities? Now, I guess it's a possibility that there are hidden costs there and they're not telling us about, or equivalently, that somehow or other delivering water in Apple Valley is a lot more expensive than it is in Hesperia or Victorville. But I'm dubious. I've looked around. I haven't seen anything that would suggest as such. And the numbers I just cited you, by the way, came out of a state audit of the situation done by people who are qualified accountants, probably more qualified than I am to read these numbers and come up with the honest answers. So if I added it all up, again, typically, and I will tell you the truth is almost always in the middle, I don't see it this time. I think these criticisms are empty. I think they're designed to distract people from the reality of the situation. The reality of the situation is this. This is, from my perspective, a good investment. No investment is risk-free. I'm not guaranteeing this is going to pan out perfectly for you. But I will tell you, relative to the potential rate of return, the kind of risk you're taking on is really small. From a portfolio standpoint, this is a good financial move. So there's my financial advice for tonight. This is a smart purchase. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Thornberg. I appreciate that, and I can certainly identify. I own a business, as a couple of us do on the council, and understand retained earnings and profit and taxes and depreciation and all that figures in. I'm glad you're able to say it more eloquently than I can ever try to explain to people.
I'm not sure how eloquently I said it, but
yeah, it's tough to somebody who's not involved in there. It's very difficult to visualize what that means and what it means in the form of taxes and how that works and how it relates to the price of the product you actually end up selling to somebody. But it's a fact that's out there. So at this point in time, we have council member questions. So I'd like to open it up to the council. I'm going to start with Councilmember Cusack, and
I
down the line
appreciate you
and
coming
see.
and doing that analysis for us. It was, it's when it's coming from the town and Mark's done the analysis and done the analysis and done the analysis. It's good to get an outside look at what we're looking at. I mean, it's a big decision for our community to make this decision for our council. I mean, we're always scrutinized on any decision we make, but we always try to have the best interests of our community. And when we do this, that's why we get elected for it. But I do appreciate it. It sheds a new light for some people that were questioning whether Mark's analysis was correct. You did a great job in going through it. Me owning my own business and understanding a lot of the stuff that goes on, it just, we all have people come in and evaluate our own businesses to make sure we're doing our stuff right as well. So in audits and everything else. So it's part of what we do. So I do appreciate that. I don't really have any questions. I just want to thank you for coming and doing this for us. I know you're a busy man, and I appreciate that.
Not at all.
Thank
It's a pleasure.
Councilmember Stanton, current mayor this evening. So
Thank you, Mayor. Oh, yeah, I kind of liked it. No, thank you very much. Thank you. I appreciate your report so much tonight. To hear, as my colleague said, outside of the town staff, these numbers, they're so strong. And when you're with your analysis, the efficiency, the gains, and the realistic picture of where we've been with interest rates, I mean, those are facts. There's not this wide window. I also want to thank you for your clarity towards the end as you made the statement. Well, you made a couple of statements. One was that we don't have a crystal ball, in essence, is what you said. And we all know that in life. When you step out and say, we're going to do something, it takes guts, it takes courage, and it takes conviction, because it isn't easy. And some of you folks that I haven't seen here a lot before, what you heard tonight, we've heard for well over a year, citizens' concerns. Some of them are polite, some are not so polite, and it's difficult. At the end of the day, we will be going, I hope I can say this, to an election and leave it at that. We'll all be participating is what I want to say. And I'm pleased to hear this information. I hope that you share it, of those of you that are undecided, because it is a big deal. I've lived here for almost 30 years. I have rocks in my yard front and back. It was a long journey to get there, and several thousands of dollars. And this just makes such sense for our community. I'll be long gone. I'll be 70 in a couple of years. But I know that the future for the kids that are here and the families that are here, they can put lawns back in their yard, even if it's a small segment. They can live again, as we have been entitled to in the past until the most recent years in the town of Apple Valley. Thank you very much.
Councilmember Remick?
I think they pretty much said it all, but I think one of the most important things that you said at the very beginning, first of all, thank you for being here. I really appreciate it. You said that you couldn't guarantee the outcome of this. You would go into this and you would come up with honest numbers and produce honest opinions and base it on history. You did a very good job there. Excellent. It's really refreshing to see these numbers because, I mean, you start hearing things over and over and over again and getting bombarded day after day after day. Well, maybe that's right. Is that right, what we're seeing every day? You know, it's just, it's crazy stuff. Yeah. And to have you come in here and just, you know, point it out, back it up with history and the other things that I've seen, and I can relate to a lot of this stuff that you're talking about over the years. You know, I've been here too. And it's just great. It's refreshing. It's particularly good that you weren't coerced in getting these numbers. You came up with these honest numbers. And with that said, I think this needs to be analyzed by the general public before anybody makes a decision so they can get the truth of the matter.
Yeah, and to your point, you know, again, this is relatively short order. I will tell you I looked at history, I looked at top-level numbers, but we did fact-check. I mean, I went through the public record. I looked at the numbers that I cited in my report. I made sure that they were accurate. The interest rates and stuff I pulled right out of the data. There's nothing in my report that I'm uncomfortable with. And, yes, I did take some of the town's numbers, but remember, my analysis, I came up with sort of my own set and then compared them to what the town came up with. And again, I didn't find anything there that I found alarming. Rather, I came up with my own range, and the city's, I'm sorry, the town, I keep confusing town and city, but the town, the town's numbers, I think, were very cautious, candidly.
Mm-hmm. Well done. Thank you very much.
Mayor Pro Tem Bishop, you have a question?
Thank you
or
much.
Comment? And I'll-
First off, thank you for all your input. Unlike other things that our poor citizens keep getting in their mailboxes constantly, your rates are going to go sky high. You can't trust government. $500 a year increases.
We want to make sure that we limit this to the fact that this particular report is being prepared in the wake of nearly 4 years of other reports and information that has been included, repeated appeals to the California Public Utilities Commission, analysis of the CPUC decisions, analysis of the decision by the Carlyle Group to purchase Apple Valley Ranchos Water Company, analysis of the decision by Algonquin to purchase from Carlyle, and in fact the town has, as provided by state law, already prepared an appraisal of the value of this particular water utility. And as I think many of the citizens know here tonight, has actively followed the events in Missoula, Montana, as we are on the cusp of Missoula, Montana taking ownership of that particular asset from Algonquin, as was mentioned in the presentation this evening. And more importantly, the town has filed an action as permitted by California law to acquire this asset for the public under the eminent domain laws of the state of California. And we pretty much want to make sure that all the town council comments this evening are within the context of that very long history of how we got to this point.
Back?
In other words, it's back to you.
Okay.
But
I
in those confines.
I agree completely that seems to be that the citizens of Apple Valley are stuck into a regulated monopoly. Your words, and I agree with you completely. I also think that I thank you for when you did your report, you looked at Dr. Using's report. You looked at the town's information. It was not a one-sided. You tried to look at both sides, and in my opinion, I thought you gave a very fair and reliable report back to the town staff on what truly you saw as an outside independent economic specialist. My question, even though you touched on it, because I do have a question, briefly, is the town has been trying to do the best it possibly can based on a 2015 numbers, based on a 2015 report. We know, you had mentioned this evening, that Liberty is actually required by the state to have turned in by March of 2017 their 2016 report, which you just shared with us, to this date still has not been turned in. I may have my opinions on that, but as a professional economist, why would a company at this mega level not turn in their required report to the state of California in a timely manner required by law?
There's two answers for that, neither of which are good. One is basic incompetence, that they don't seem to understand what the rules are and how to follow them. And two is there is the basic understanding that that report may contain information they don't want people to see prior to saying, and we say any further conversations on the matter.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. And I wanted to touch on a little bit. You did talk a little bit about the California Public Utilities Commission. And a lot of folks, and when we talk about this in general, and you said it too, you know, they don't trust government to do the job that private industry can do. And my response in a lot of cases is, well, it's the state Public Utilities Commission that's in charge of regulating this, as you said, a monopoly. And if they did their job, if they made them put the reports on time and made them accountable for their investments and made sure the public was involved in those investments, we probably wouldn't be here today. And so, you know, and I don't know if you can speak to that government level versus a local government, but there's a difference there as well, and that's really kind of defines, as I say, a different model. You have a large government entity controlling a for-profit monopoly, and so, you know, if they're really holding them accountable at that level, then maybe, you know, the interest rates, all that stuff might go away. But when you have local government being held accountable by local citizens, it seems to be a different model, and you spoke a little bit about that, but did you research that model and insufficiencies at all, or
Yeah,
maybe
and-
lack of efficiencies?
Yeah. Yes. Your point's well taken, Mayor. It is. I think it's important for people to recognize that the CPUC is in charge, really, of regulating an industry, not managing an industry. Right. At many levels, you know, there are people who complain about whether or not they are regulating utilities in the state sufficiently. We know of some scandals that have occurred lately in various sorts of ways. I don't think we really need to get that deep into those particular questions, because this really isn't about the CPUC. Okay. Ultimately, the CPUC is there to regulate utilities, not to manage them. The management should be done by the people who own it. And ultimately, the question I think people of the town need to think about is whether that management will be done better here or by some large corporation in Toronto, Canada. Now, again, I'm all for private markets. I'm all for free enterprise where competition can exist. Because I understand that, say, when it comes to cars and GM is being run horribly by their management, that will be dealt with when they start losing massive amounts of market share to Honda, Toyota. The problem here is that process doesn't exist. People in Apple Valley do not have that competitive option. They don't have alternative choices. So the best they can do is raise their complaint to the owners. And again, how do they do that when the owner's in Toronto? Much better to keep it here from that particular perspective.
I know we've raised our concerns, that was mentioned before the Public Utilities Commission, but it seems like whenever we're successful in reducing rates or getting them to listen to us a little bit, they come back in the form of surcharges, and that's has been kind of a effort and fertility, and has not panned out the way we had always hoped it would. And I think it goes to show that the Public Utilities Commission, none of them are elected. None of them are legislative oversight. It's all appointed by the governor. And we've actually talked to our legislators, but the governor likes that control over that entity, I guess. So we're not going to get anywhere there, but I appreciate your comments. Is there any other questions? Yeah.
I just want to reiterate what I said earlier. One of the last things you said, Dr. Thornberg, this is a smart move. Thank you.
Okay, Dr. Thornberg, thank you very much. Appreciate the input.
Thank you.
Council
Thank you very
members,
much.
Madam Mayor, thank you very much.
Yeah, man, thank you. All right.